If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help me keep it going, there's a few things you could do to help. You can make a donation on my website, andyhedges.com, and while you're there, you can join my email list. Or you could leave a review on the iTunes store. And most importantly, you could tell your friends to give the show a listen. I'd like to start today's show with a poem by today's guest, Vess Quinlan. This is from Vess's 1990 book of poems called The Trouble with the Dreams, and this poem is entitled Sold Out. The worst will come tomorrow when we load the saddle horses. We are past turning back. The horses must be sold. The old man turns away, hurting, as the last cow is loaded. I hunt words to ease his pain, but there's nothing to say. He walks away to lean on a top rail of the corral and look across the calving pasture toward the willow-grown creek. I follow, absently mimicking his walk, and stand a post away. We don't speak of causes or reasons. Don't speak at all. We just stand there, leaning on the weathered poles, while shadows consume the pasture. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Vess Quinlan. Vess is a former rancher, a poet, and a truck driver. He is widely respected as one of the most thoughtful and insightful of contemporary cowboy poets, and he now serves on the Western Folklife Center's Board of Trustees. I sat down with Vess during the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, and recorded this interview. Here's Vess Quinlan.
Both sides of the family go back to 1800s, the cow business in Colorado. Well, my great-grandfather, J.P., stowed away on a ship called Montana in Liverpool, England, and took one look at the east and decided he didn't like that, so he came west and homesteaded where Rock Creek joins the Grand River. And he didn't have any money, so he would file mining claims all over the mountains of the West. He found the Little Johnny in Leadville, one of the richest silver mines in the country, and then he'd sell the claim and put the money in cows over on Rock Creek. And so that was on my dad's side of the family, for that part of the family. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather came in before J.P. did and helped build the railroad grade from Denver to Pueblo when it was done with teams, of course, and Fresnos. And then that winter, he worked for the railroad, taking care of all the mules and horses down at Rye, Colorado. His name was Sam, and he got the nickname Sam the Mule Creek Man, Long Creek Sam. He was on Long Creek down there. Long Creek Sam the Mule Man is what they nicknamed him. And then they run cows in that country all over. And then my grandmother's brothers run cows out south of Fowler, Colorado, South Pueblo. So it's the family history as far as ranching goes way back. I never really thought of myself as a cowboy like some of these guys that work for the big ranches do. I grew up in the mountains working family ranches, so I was a ranch hand. You know, I never really thought of myself as a cowboy. And one time, sitting with Buck down at Lubbock at one of the early gatherings, Buck and a bunch of them sitting around. They were telling stories about this guy, and this guy wasn't quite cowboy enough, and this guy chorded his guitar instead of finger picking it and all this stuff. And I finally got tired of it. And I said, I hate to tell you guys this. The only cowboy work I ever did was riding pins. Hear this gasp around the table. And Buck said, oh, baloney. He said, you never worked for a feedlot in your life. And I said, no, but by the time I got here, the country was fenced up. I said, I rode some pretty big pins, but they were pins nonetheless. And Buck laughing about that. But my granddad, on my mother's side, was a cowboy. And he worked for Charlie Goodnight at the Goodnight Ranch at Pueblo. And they took a bunch of horses north, some deal with the Indians way up in Montana. And he had one of those big round pictures of that crew up there. And he said that they got snowed in up there after they delivered those horses and couldn't get back. So they went to work for a ranch feeding cattle up there, what they were doing. And the ranch was owned by a German immigrant and his wife. And said when they first got up there, they fed them well, and she'd set these big tubs of butter out on the table and pancakes in the morning and eggs and all that stuff. And said she found out that she could sell that butter for pretty good money in town. So he said she would set the butter out on the windowsill and it would freeze hard as a rock. And he said, my granddad said the entertainment that minute was watching a new hand try to get enough butter off of that, chipping up butter off there for his pancakes. And that was their amusement all winter long. And so he had a lot of stories, and he was a pretty well-known horseman, trained horses, and pretty well-known bronc rider there. And my mother's two brothers, the ones I'm named after, there have been several generations of Vesses and Vans, and they were out south of Pueblo, be east of Pueblo a little ways, and then south in that old rough country toward Folsom, New Mexico, down in there. And the way they kept going, I guess, was gathering wild horses. And it was during World War I, or before World War I, I guess, and they were selling the horses to the Army. And they said that they would run those horses in, and the Army rule was you had to ride the horse by the government Army guy and then turn around and ride him back in the pen. He had to see both sides of the horse. So what they would do is they'd take those horses, and they said they'd front foot them, knock them down, hold them down with their own, blindfold them, saddle them, and when one of them stood up, one of those guys was riding them. And I had in my head, when my Uncle Wayne was telling me about this, that those horses would buck down the alley and hit the end and buck back up. But my Uncle Wayne said he was a little kid watching them do that, and he said those horses were so scared they'd run. He said they never saw one buck. They'd just run down and hit the end of the alley and run back, and then they'd jerk saddle off. And I was reading Will Rogers' autobiography, and he's talking about the Army guys trained them to use their horses. He said they'd line those guys up as far as you could see, a horse and a man. And some of them were town kids that never had been around a horse at all. They figured the cavalry would be better than walking. And he said the sergeant would holler, mount up, and there'd be bodies and dust flying every which direction. They'd gather them all up and take the hurt ones off to the dispensary and line them up and do it again. And they did that until they rode those horses. And when I was reading that in Will Rogers' autobiography, I thought, I know where they got those horses. Can you imagine what those horses were like? Never seen a man before, and to get front-footed and knocked down and blindfolded and held by your ear and ridden by the Army buyer and back into the corral and then shipped, and some poor recruit would get that horse. Glad I didn't live in those days. I couldn't have done that. But what I did is I had my uncles would come and get me as soon as school was out, and I would spend almost every summer with one of them on one of the ranches they were on, up until I was 11. And my Uncle Dell liked to snub horses. He started every horse snubbing him, break him to lead. He had a big old horse he called Tony, and he'd turn one of them big old colts in with Tony and let him kind of buddy up, what was going on. Then basically they were rough with horses. I mean, in those days, long before the Dorrance brothers around. So he would rope that horse, tie him up to a snubbing post, pull him up to a snubbing post, put a big heavy halter on him with blinders on it, and a loop reins so I couldn't drop the reins, get scared and drop the reins. And then he had a snub rope, and he would put my saddle. I rode my Aunt Helen's saddle, and had a wooden stirrups on it that were wide, and he'd put a board on it so I couldn't get my foot through and get hung up in the stirrup. All I could get in there was my toes. And he would pull that colt's head practically up in his lap and take a dally around the saddle horn. And he'd start around the corral 2 or 3 times until that colt figured out it was easier to follow Tony than it was to fight that deal. And as soon as he got that colt following him, he'd holler at me, and I'd come over, and he'd pull his foot out of the stirrup and reach down and grab me by the arm and pick me up, and I'd crawl across the saddle and sit down on that colt. And my job was he'd had a snaffle bit in there, and my job was to cue that colt, cue him with the right turn, and then if the colt didn't turn, Dell would crowd him and cue him with a little left, and if he didn't turn, he'd jerk him around, cue him to stop, and if he didn't stop, Dell would reach out and slap him in the face with gloves. Well, somewhere during the day of doing this, Dell would say, "Here, hold this," and he'd hand me the snub rope, and here I'm sitting on a colt that doesn't know any more than I do. And of course, the colt's tendency is to follow that snub horse that he's been following. So amazingly enough, after not very period of time, that colt would start responding to my cues. When I cued him to stop, it wasn't very long before he learned out he better stop. If Tony stopped, he better stop. He better not try to walk past Tony. And if I cued him to turn right, he knew he better do that. Scare me to death. I mean, I was absolutely scared to death doing that. And I learned not to say things like, what if he starts bucking? Because Dell would say, well, if I was you, I'd ride him till he quits. The ground looks like it's pretty hard out here. And if I'd say, well, what if he runs away? Nah, you can't outrun Tony here. I'll catch you before you get to town. So there was no point in town was Sharon Springs, 30 miles away. But there was no point in objecting to that. I suppose these days that would be child abuse, but there was no point in objecting. And their objective dealing with me was to have me around as a kid and keep me from getting hurt. So they were compliments did not come easily. I remember one time a friend of my uncle's called Ed Allen come over, and they were shipping cattle, and he was short-handed. Somebody'd quit or didn't show up or whatever. Wanted to know if he could borrow me to help. And I remember Dell saying, well, yeah, you can have, I don't need him, you can have him, but he said you got to keep an eye on him because he only pays attention about half the time. And then he'd say things like, oh, and don't let him near any machinery because he could tear up an anvil with a rubber hammer. I suppose today that would be considered verbal abuse, but what it really was you had to learn when you were a kid around those animals, you had to learn to pay attention. And so I always said that those uncles were expert deflators of excess self-esteem, a kid. But they would give it back to you, because I remember going to the ranch, and Ed Allen said to me, he said, you know, when you're not around, your Uncle Dell's always talking about what a good hand you're making. That summer, I got polio. So I went from being a potential top hand to being damaged goods, crippled child. Scared those guys to death. So there was no more going on the ranches, no more of that stuff. So I went from that world of, it's not a real stretch to imagine me getting bucked off in a cactus patch and having one of them uncles ride up and look down and say, "You're going to help us sort these cows, or you're going to lay there and bleed." I mean, that was a kind of the way they did. And it wasn't, it sounds mean, but they weren't. I mean, it wasn't, I don't regret a day of that. And that was the way the culture worked. And I think the reason for it was they had to keep you aware constantly. And I remember Ed Allen taking me back and saying, "Uncle, I was always talking about how good a hand you are when you're not around. But when you're around, you can hardly find the floor with your hat." You can barely do that. So that was a real life-changing thing for me. I went from being expected to be as good a part of whatever work was going on as I was capable of being, to being to the world of doctors and physical therapists and occupational therapists and teachers and everybody telling you what you had to do. And unfortunately, they would start every sentence with, whenever I said what I wanted to do, they'd start every sentence with, but you can't do that. You can't do that. You have to go to school, and they would give me aptitude tests, and I'd say, well, you have an aptitude, you could be a lawyer, you could be this, or you could be that, you could be the other. But it was too late, because I'd already got that whole culture. My granddad said about it one time, he said, you've ruined that boy, you've got that cowboy stuff in his head, and you'll never get it out. He said, everybody knows you can make a cowboy out of pretty near anything, but you can't make hardly nothing out of a cowboy, so he's done, And they would bring me Will James books when I was in the hospital, and J.R. Williams cartoons, and I read Andy Adams and all of that stuff that they were reading and had read. My grandmother had a box of poems that were cut out of the Livestock Journal and cut out of the calendars and stuff under the bed. And they brought me that box of poems. So that's where I learned the Kiskaddon poems and read all those poems and all that stuff. So by the time I got 15 years old, I ran away from home. I wouldn't do what anybody wanted me to do. I just flatly refused. And they brought my granddad to talk to me. They figured the only one I'd listen to was him. And he come ask me, one time, he said, they tried to get my high school stuff changed to college preparatory courses, and I wouldn't do it. So they figured he'd listen to me. So he come and he asked me, he said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your life? And I said, well, I'm going to, someday I'd like to have a little place of my own and a little bunch of cows of my own, and that's what I'm going to do. My granddad said, well, he said, you do know that if you're real good at this and you have really good luck, you'll live poor and you'll live poor and probably die with a place paid for, but you'll live hard all the way. You got to be ready. The place will take everything you ever make. You have to put everything into that. And he said, the other problem is you can't just follow off any old gal that looks good to you. He said, you got to have a special kind of a woman if you're going to do this. He said, you're going to have a woman who is able to understand how you can go to the sale and buy $10,000 worth of herd bulls, but you can't afford linoleum for the kitchen. And he's absolutely right. Those family places will take about all you've got. And you're gonna, if you don't really like what you're doing, if you're not willing to be grateful for the advantages that are there, you best not do it, because it's too constantly a struggle, and you never know what's going to happen to you next, and you never know what each year is going to bring. And so I worked for family ranches where they'd have 160 or maybe 320 acres of meadow along a creek or a river someplace in the mountains. And they ran their cattle in a cattle pool on the forest. So there was always a pool rider that took care of everybody's cattle up there. And in the wintertime, fed with a team. You had to, because we didn't have tractors big enough to plow snow. So you fed with a team and a sled. And every morning it was get up and get your team ready and feed your cows. And almost all the families, all those ranch families, milked 4 or 5 cows and sold the cream. So you had a separator and you had all of this work to do. That's why I was able to run away from home and survive. It was because almost any time I could find somebody that would let me help them milk cows. So I milked cows. I went to 9 high schools before I got out of high school, if you count the ones twice that I went back to. And I could, almost anywhere I go, I could find somebody that needed, but they wouldn't let me not go to school. I could work for them. I'd live in a bunkhouse and milk cows and help feed, but I always had to go to school with their kids. And when I got ready to graduate from high school at Basalt, Colorado, they started trying to put a transcript together to let me graduate with the 8 other kids that were graduating that year. And I didn't have the credits. They couldn't find the credits to put together. In fact, the guy I was working for that year just died here the other day. He was 111 years old. And 100 years and 11 weeks, and his ambition was to live to be 100. But I was up the Frying Pan River out of Basalt, Aspen over there, and he milked 4 cows, separated it, sold the cream. We had a heart attack when I was up there. I graduated in 58, so that had to have been 57 or 58. And there was nobody to drive the school bus. And by that time, I had gotten a chauffeur's license, which you could get at 17, to haul logs in the summertime. And there was nobody to drive the bus. So I drove the bus up and down the Frying Pan River all the time Jim had a heart attack down until school was out. And when it come time for me to graduate, I didn't have the credits. And they said the president of the school board was an old Italian immigrant. And when the superintendent of schools or the principal said, we can't give him a diploma, he hasn't earned it. And they said, that old guy said, you mean to tell me we can trust him to haul our kids up and down that icy son of a bitch of a river all winter, but we can't trust him with a high school diploma? And I got my high school diploma. So, but I never had to show it to anybody, the kind of work I did. But so I really got my high school diploma for driving a school bus when I was 17 years old. It was a different world, a totally different world, where we were expected to do our share of the work. There was so much work to do. Imagine that. You'd get up before daylight, harness a team. We'd try to usually load the hay we were going to feed the night before, harness a team, hook onto the feed wagon, and feed those cows, and then either go down and try to load the wagon out of the loose haystack for the sled out for the next morning, the next day. Then you had to milk all 4 of those cows, and after you got through milking them, you weren't through. You had to go in and run that through the separator, and usually kept little pigs around to drink the skim milk, barley and skim milk. And then you had to wash the separator. That meant taking all of those discs apart and washing each one of them, and you had to get all the discs strung back on the little stringer that held the discs to get them all in the right place or it wouldn't work, separator wouldn't work. And we had to stand there and hand crank that thing till we cranked all that cream through that separator. And that's what we did before we went to school. Then you went to school and usually riding a bus several miles to school, and then riding a bus several miles home and do all those chores again at night. Now that was the world I grew up in, and you had to do it because the whole family had to contribute to the survival of the family. Those subsistence ranches. It wasn't as bad as it sounds. I mean, nowadays, I don't know what people would think of kids working like that to that extent, and they may expect to do those things. And sending a 10, 12-year-old kid out to harness a team of workhorses, I don't know. I don't even know what people would think about that. But that's the way it was done. So that was my background and my introduction into that. And then we finally worked on ranches all over as a ranch hand, and stuff like that. And finally got a place of our own in the San Luis Valley. Most of our neighbors were running sheep, and I had never seen a lamb born. I'd been around cattle all my life. So I bought about 1,000 head of ewes to learn on, sort of a learning herd, and we went in the sheep business. And when my middle son took over the livestock part of our deal down there, no sheep, back to cows. And the reason he didn't want sheep was he would go out to herd the sheep in in the summertime. And he and his friend, he had a friend, neighbor friend there, and they'd go, supposed to be watching the sheep. And they'd get off playing someplace, and the sheep were always, he was always in trouble with those sheep. But one day, the worst of it ever happened was they were supposed to let the sheep out to water the sheep, and they didn't do it. They didn't water the sheep. Well, the sheep got through a fence and got into a concrete ditch, and the concrete ditch was slick, and those sheep were trying to drink out of that big ditch. They started falling in the ditch, going down the ditch, and they plugged up the culvert. And the county had to come out, and they had to shut the water off, of course, and everybody's irrigation system on down the ditch was shut down. And county had to come out and do something with the roads, all the water running over the road. And then my son had to crawl in the culvert and hook a rope on the dead sheep to drag them out of that culvert. That was it for the sheep. When he got his choice, he went right back to cows. So the last few years we were down there, we run cows and raised alfalfa. And we went to a little family outfit, just like I had been raised on, worked on. And I never had any real interest in working for the big ranches. I just never, I was never around it. It never occurred to me. Probably if I'd have been around one of them, I would have, like Buck did and Joel Nelson and all those guys, where they worked on the big cow ranches where there's about more room. But that wasn't my experience. Mine was totally different than that. Almost all small family outfits. They're all gone now. I don't think there are very few of them left in the country. All that country and all that stuff has gotten into bigger and bigger operations. A lot of it absentee. So when I started working for the bigger ranches that I worked for, by the time I got around to doing that, were ranches that had been combined from several little ranches. I worked for Bridwell Land and Cattle Company. They had a place east of Aguilar, between Walsenburg and Trinidad. And Bridwell come up there and bought that, what was called the Vega Ranch, and 2 or 3 or 4 other ranches, and put them together. And so they made a big ranch out of several family ranches. That was the biggest outfit I ever worked for, was Bridwell's. And I think there were 3 of us that worked there. And that was the closest I ever had to a riding job. I was horseback most of the time on that outfit. It was a different world. And the poems came from, I think the poems started with being in that hospital so long, reading those poems. I started writing then. My mother loved poems. She always had books of poetry around. And in those days, if you went to any kind of a gathering of ranchers or so, there'd be somebody there that would just do the entertainment was in. We didn't have entertainment from outside. It was all inside. So if you had a meeting of the Grange or a meeting of whatever meeting you went to, there was always somebody there that played an accordion, and always somebody there that would do a poem, and somebody there would play guitar and sing. There was always that kind of local personal entertainment. And then the only other entertainment we had was there was a dance somewhere within reach every Saturday night. So there was always a little band of a guitar and usually a fiddle, and everybody went to those dances. Take the kids to them. There'd be babies and bassinets along the floor on those dances when those dances went on, and they would go on till daylight if somebody would keep passing the hat to keep the band playing, and that was our entertainment. No television, no radio, and in a lot of the places no electricity. We had a wind charger on that place I was on with Dell, and a bunch of batteries under the floor of the water tower. So we were off the grid. And my aunt had a washing machine with a little gasoline motor on it. And she could never get this thing started. And so I would always have to figure out how to get that motor started for her so she could wash clothes. I don't know, it's hard to think about how how we survived, not how we survived necessarily, but how we developed as people, as individuals, how our values system developed as a result of growing up that way. You didn't have if you didn't have siblings, you didn't have friends your age around usually. And especially with me, my friends were old cowboys, the old men, the old guys that worked for those ranches. And when my dad and my uncles went off to World War II, all that was left in those communities were the old World War I veterans, the women, and the guys who were 4F or couldn't go in the service for one reason. So my heroes were old World War I cowboys. That's the ones that I learned from, and they're the ones that knew the poems, and they're the ones you heard recite the poems. Was those guys, and so that I've heard those from the time I was little. There was always somebody there that would do service poems, or you'd hear the cremation of Sam McGee over and over again over the years. Somebody always knew how to do that. Casey at the bat, that kind of stuff. And the cowboy poems, the ones that ended up published in the Record Stockman and the Western Livestock Journal, and the Kiskadon poems. When we did the first gatherings here, I don't think the folklorists really knew who Kiskadon was, or they might have known who he was, but they didn't understand the impact that the Kiskadon poems had on the ranch people. They were aware of the stuff that John Lomax collected and the stuff that was collected in the anthologies, that stuff. But I think they were surprised to find out that most of the ranch people knew a Kiskadon poem. Well, of course, he was published in almost all those papers every week and on the calendars, and they would take the Kiskadon poem and send it to New Mexico, where there was a young crippled woman named Catherine Field, and she would read the poem and draw an illustration and send it back. And I think they said they paid Catherine Field $5 and Kiskadon $5 for his poem. Got one in every paper. My grandmother had collected those for years, so I had a shoebox full of Kiskadon poems and poems that come out in the Western Livestock Journal. So that's where that early poetry influence come from. And then I think I started writing myself from the isolation of being quarantined, and that was an escape. That's the way I get away from what was going on around me. Was start doing things in my own head. I lived in my own head quite a bit. Just would disconnect from what was going on around me. I almost had to, because the treatment that for the polio at that time was almost like a torture chamber. They would take strips of wool about 4 or 5 inches wide, maybe 3 feet long, and in hot water, and then they'd spin them in this high-speed spin dryer till they were dry. Then they would wrap those wool strips around your arms, around your legs, and around your body, and then I would be strapped on a board with my feet like this. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to keep those muscles were drawing us up into a ball, and they were trying to keep those muscles stretched out. So after they'd put those packs on me, then they would, and this happened 24 hours a day, then they would take us downstairs across to the annex, put us in a jacuzzi, and then the physical therapist would try to stretch all those muscles that were pulling up. So he'd put my heel on his shoulder, lock his fingers over my knee, and stretch those muscles, make those muscles stretch. And it felt like he was ripping them out by the roots. It was extremely, extremely painful. And then back upstairs you'd go, and back in the wool packs, and then back down in the jacuzzi, and then back and be stretched again. They were doing that over and over and over again. And that went on until, I guess, until the muscle stopped contracting. And by that time, sometimes the damage was done, so they had to cut. I had what was called a drop foot, where the tendon in the back of your leg pulls up, shrinks, contracts. And so they cut that tendon and lengthened it, spliced it. And we're talking about 1951, not the surgery techniques you have now. And they cut my toe open and took the muscle out of my toe and spliced it in my foot so I could lift my foot. Well, I can only lift that foot just a little bit, the length of that toe muscle. And then they put wires in my toe. so I got one toe that my big toe on my right foot is stiff. And I remember the wires, I don't know what they were, silver little tiny wires. And I remember a cow stepping on my foot one time on that toe, and one of those wires come out through the top of my toe, little tiny silver wires. And she must have broke it and let it come out like a splinter. And I remember taking a pair of pliers and jerking that thing out of my toe. But that stiff toe gives me balance problems at times. And it gave me, and so I was never, I could never have been a bronc rider because my legs wouldn't stand it. I never could have done any of the stuff that everybody else did. And I had to I had a different attitude, I think, toward work than most people did. To me, work was this enormous privilege. Whenever I'd go hunting for a job, dragging that crippled leg, I would have to argue my way into that job. The first thing people would say to me was, well, I don't think you can do this. We need this or we need that. And I remember one time I was feeding cows and milking cows for these guys up above Rye. And come summertime, they didn't really need me anymore. And there was a guy set up a little sawmill down there named Billy Bant. So we were moving some cows up there someplace, and I come back. And Billy only saw me horseback. So I rode up and told him I was looking for a job. And he said, my slab packer off there got drunk and he's in jail. So he said, I'm packing slabs today. And so he said, I really need somebody to pack these slabs. So I said, okay, I'll be here in the morning. So I come up, and the first time he saw me limping into that, and he had no idea when he was seeing me horseback that was crippled. And he said, I don't think you could do this. He said, had a roller come down like that, and I would, little space between, and I'd grab these old green heavy slabs, walk across the track that the carriage run on, and set them on crossways on a dump truck, and then do it again. And I remember I managed to do it. So what I told Billy, I said, I'll tell you what, let me work till noon, and by noon, we'll both know if I can't do this or if I can do it. And if I can't, we'll both know it, and I'll just go on about my business. And there have been several times I talked myself into a job like that, on that basis. So I think it pretty much changed my attitude toward work. It wasn't something I did to make enough money to buy a boat so I could go fishing. Work was the center of what I did. It took everything I had to make a hand, And so that experience with my uncles, that business of teaching me to pay attention. We were always struggling, and I remember working with him, and I was constantly worried that I was going to do the wrong thing or be in the wrong place or not make the right decision, And you never got yelled at, of course, like people yell at their kids. You don't yell at kids when you're working cows. You don't yell at nobody when you're working cows. But there was this look, whenever you do something wrong or be in the wrong place, you'd get this look from one of these uncles. And I learned to translate that look. And what that look was, I wonder if they mixed up the babies at the hospital, because nobody of this tribe would have let that cow go by. Nobody would have done that in this tribe. I wonder if somewhere there is a little cowboy selling ladies' shoes, and I'm stuck here with a shoe salesman sorting cows. But that look would just stop you from whatever you're doing. It was worse than being beaten with a stick to have one of those uncles look at you like, where'd this kid come from? Can't possibly be one of us. But I survived that.
Everyone seems to have a different definition of what is and isn't cowboy poetry, and who is and isn't a cowboy. My friend Andy Wilkinson wrote a song based on a quote by working cowboy and cutting horse legend Buster Welch. Andy's song says this: "If you know when to ride up, if you know when to pull up, if you know when to shut up, welcome to the tribe."
I'll give you Buck's answer. Somebody asked Buck what a cowboy song was. He said, any damn song a cowboy wants to sing. Same thing's true of this poem. Anything that strikes you where you live in this culture, where you do this stuff. Joel Nelson is good at that. He does all kinds of stuff that isn't necessarily cowboy stuff. I do some of Guy Clark's stuff. I do poems that aren't about cowboying, but they could have been or should have been, or whatever's going on in that poem is something that these audiences that we can connect into. I don't know how to define it. One of the things I did say to those guys one time, when you start trying to define what a cowboy is, be careful what circles you draw, because I can draw a circle that'll keep y'all out. You know, I can draw a circle little. If you define the cowboy as the people that were here when they stole the first cows in Texas and headed them up there in Mexico and headed them up the trail, did the cowboy world end with barbed wire? Was the cowboy only the guy who was living on the trail with the cattle? Or are cowboys people who take care of cows? So I would say that if you're involved in the care of animals, cows or sheep or probably horses or any animal, you have to have this mentality, that mentality to do that. You don't. There's certain things like my granddad used to say things like, a milk cow builds character, because no decent human being will leave a milk cow bawling at the gate with a full bag because he has a headache. You go milk your damn cow and then enjoy your headache. Nobody would come in on a tired horse and leave the horse standing there while you go get something to eat. You just wouldn't do that. And if you were working with somebody and saw him do that, you decide maybe you didn't want that guy around much longer. So there were all these things that have to do with this culture, that have to do with, I guess the modern word would be stewardship. Because if you do not look after your stock, if you do not look after your country, you cannot survive in this culture at all. It'll get you, and it'll get you fast. If you aren't capable of figuring things out as you go along, things are changing constantly when you're dealing with. If you can't see when you're working with a bunch of cows what that cow's thinking about doing next, and be one step ahead of her, you're going to have trouble. And if you're working with a few cows and some other people in a corral, you have to be aware of everything that's going on around you all the time so that you don't run a cow under somebody else. So you have to be aware of what everybody else is doing. You have to be able to take direction and to pay attention. If you're gathering cattle in a pasture, you have to listen to what the guy is telling you. I want you to go here. I want you to go to that pond. I want you to gather those cattle in that, and I want you to bring them here, and we'll come back down here. So you start out 4 or 5 of you to gather a pasture. Well, if you don't pay attention to what you're supposed to be doing and do it, you're not going to have a successful gather. You're going to miss cows. So it's like almost it's either born into you or you learn it fast, how to do that. The poetry, if you really look at this poetry, think of what this poetry is about. It is occupational poetry. It has to do with the work, almost invariably, and things that relate to the work. So there's a certain kind of poetry, and cowboy poetry is only one part of it. There's logger poetry, there's fisherman poetry, there's cowboy poetry, there's explorer poetry, there's miner poetry, there's sailor poetry, poetry that comes from the sea, and all of those occupational poems tend to be the same kind of subjects because of the things you have to do. So what we're doing, rather than creative writing, what we're doing with these poems is putting down the life that we live and the things that we do and the work that we do and the things that it takes to get those things done. And so naturally, that all of a sudden becomes family poems. So you'll end up with poems about families and poems about horses and poems about all the stuff that connects to this. You'll end up with poems about grass and poems about the country and poems about all of this stuff. I don't know of any accounting poems or lawyer poems or anything like that. It's like Dave Stamey said, there's a lot of doctors and lawyers that dress up like cowboys, but there aren't very many cowboys going around dressed up like doctors or lawyers. And it's true. What is there about this that attracts these people? I've written poems about these people that come to these gatherings, and they're obviously successful, professional people. What they want to talk about is the summer they spent on their dad's or in their granddad's place, or the summer they spent on their uncle's ranch in Wyoming. I wrote a poem about a guy one time that there was a priest that lived in Pueblo, and every time we were doing anything with cows, this priest would show up. And what Anthony used to say is that priest would come and get in the way, and he'd stay there all day. But he loved it, absolutely loved it. And I wrote a poem about a little boy that grew up in a wealthy family back east that wanted to be a cowboy. And there were lines in there like he would pretend the sash cords were a set of bridle reins, and nobody knew about the books he read at night, and that's all he wanted to do. Well, and it goes along, and the family was wealthy, and he figured out how he could leave that wealthy family and become a cowboy. All he had to do was, when they asked him what he was going to do with his life, he'd say that he was going to preach the gospel. He was going to become a circuit riding preacher because he'd read the stories of the circuit riding preachers in the West. And he figured that once he got his education, like his dad would make him do, and did all the things that it was acceptable to become a preacher. That was part of the thing within the family. But then he could come west, get a circuit riding preaching job, and sort of leave off preaching and learn to be a real cowhand. Well, I did this whole poem. It goes all the way through, and they're burying the guy. And the way the poem ends is, and those who came to honor him would never understand about the books he read in his study late at night. Well, this guy walks up to me, and he was an Episcopal priest from Henderson, Nevada. And he said, when you were doing that poem, He said, you did that poem pretty early in the session. He said, I never heard another word said in that session. Sitting there thinking about what that poem. And he said, it was my uncle, I was on my uncle's place in Montana. And he said, that character that you created in that poem is exactly what my life. And he said, I remember clearly all of those good times on that ranch up there. Not that I regret becoming a priest, not that I regret any of that, but there is a palpable connection between people and land and animals, and it's not like anything else. And maybe it's because it requires you totally. You can't half do this. You can't leave a cow half milked. You can't half feed your cows because you get tired. You can't half shoe a horse. You have to do those things. You have to commit to them. I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it. And maybe it has something to do, too, with we're not all that far from the land. When I was born, over a fourth of Americans made their living in agriculture. 30%, almost a third, close to a third. And in my lifetime now, we're down to where we've got, 2 or 3% that are actually feeding the rest of the world, which is good, I suppose, but it makes for an entirely different culture. And I think that there is a certain desire to preserve that culture. Maybe it has to do with the families, maybe it has to do with the crews, the working together. Why is there the same kind of bonding that goes on in a crew working a bunch of cows that goes on in a logging camp, or that goes on in a mine, or that goes on in a ship, that goes on in these other things? So or in the military, that goes on in the army. There's a bond that's created among people. It goes beyond race, it goes beyond sex, it goes beyond gender. I mean, it goes beyond anything. If you make a hand in that crew, they will accept you, whatever you are or however you do. All you have to do is figure out how to make a hand. And that means paying attention and learning to do the... Buck Ramsey called us a cult of skill, which is an interesting way to think about that. A cult of skill. And if you don't evidence that skill, they'll kick you out of the cult. They'll send you to town for parts. You won't never get help. Or do something with you, but you won't survive. And is that what it's about? I don't know. That's what these poems are about. That's what all these poems are about. And you know, we had the Australians here. There's a lot of these great Australian poems. And early on in the gathering, I started seeing these poems that were like Mulga Bill's Bicycle and the Gall Darn Wheel are practically the same poem, same story, same. And I thought, well, I wonder if that was moved from Australia to here, from here to Australia. I don't know what happened, I don't think. There's a whole bunch of those poems. I think if you put men and country and women and horses and livestock out there, the same remarkable things keep happening over and over again. It's the dynamic of it. So when somebody sits down to write about it, you'll get this sort of the same poems. So I think what they are is parallel poems that would happen anyway because of the work, because of what you're doing. Backing into occupational poems. We're not inventing things. We're not creative writers in that definition. What we're doing is, sometimes I think we're trying to explain to everybody else why we would choose to follow somebody else's cows around for low wages instead of go get a real job. Maybe that's what that's all about. But that's what these poems are about, is about the work. If you really boil it all down, it's about the work. And it's about making a hand doing the work. And that extends into making a hand doing the poems. So that's why you get these poems that are pretty competently written. The good poems are well written poems because they work on them and work on them and work on them. And the stories are the same. And it's that same ethic, work ethic, I guess I'm talking about. And that's the thing we seem to want to share as much as anything else with everybody else, is what about that work is remarkable? What happens there that is worth writing about? What story in there is worth telling? And it's all about the story. And it's all about the people in these poems. So we're a sort of a different genre, if you will, of poetry, but not separate from the war poems, the soldier poems, the sailor poems, the fisherman poems, the logger poems, and all these other poems, because they're the same way. I've got quite a collection of other occupational poems. I'm still hunting for an accountant poem, but Now, there's some accountants that wrote poems, but they didn't write it about accounting. There were some insurance executives wrote poems, but they weren't about accounting. And Henry Herbert Nibbs was an executive secretary to a president of a coal company. And he decided he had enough of that and came west and wrote all those great cowboy poems and books and stories and everything else. But when he started writing, he didn't write about being an executive secretary. He imagined being a cowboy. Now, there's something definite about this, and it's something we all share at some level. That same thing, and that you picked up on it. Reading Barker stuff and reading these old time poems, and why you connected as deeply as you did with those poems is interesting to think about. And maybe people like me come by it because I was born to it way back several generations, to both the work and the writing about the work. But there are people who come into the tradition having been raised someplace else and just adapt to it like a duck to water. I mean, it connects. They know what it is. And some of the really, really good writers were not raised in this tradition, generations-wise. Very, very, very good writers. But they figured it out. They hooked into it. And I don't even know. I said early on in these gatherings that there were two ways to pay your dues at the Cowboy Poetry Bank. One was to follow somebody else's cows around to do the work, and write well enough about doing the work, and learn to write well enough to describe what you do. The other way is to write poems so well that the cowboys adopt them. That's what Henry Herbert Nibbs did. He was not a cowboy. And some of the other writers were not. Omar Barker claimed he wasn't a cowboy necessarily. He was a lot of things. But he wrote so well that cowboys adopted what he wrote. He didn't think of himself as a working cowboy, I don't think. He thought of himself as a rancher and a forest ranger and playing in the band and being a businessman. And he considers himself, I think, a Western writer trying to make money with his writing. But if you accused him of being a cowboy poet, I think he said, "Oh, wait a minute here. I write about cowboys, but I ain't one." I'm pretty sure that's what he would have said to you. But he wrote so well about them that we all love his poems. I don't think I know anybody that doesn't know a Barker poem. And what did he have? He loved it, obviously, or he couldn't have written the poems he wrote, or as many as he wrote. And there's a whole bunch of them that wrote pretty well. Well, not a whole bunch of them, but Badger Clark was not really a working cowboy as much as he was a writer. And the only real working cowboys we have that are really top-notch poets were like Cascadden, and cowboys that were actually writers, Will James and Andy Adams and those guys. But they were cowboys first, and they learned to write about it second. Charlie Russell. So there are very few of them that were actual working cowboys that left their version of what was going on. And but there were a lot of other people that did. And a lot of people got in on the act, like Jimmy Durante used to say, everybody wants to get into the act. Mike Korn said that when he first started doing these gatherings, he was a folklorist up there in Montana, and he was assigned to find the poets, cowboy poets. He said he put 100,000 miles on his pickup, and he found 2. And he said, now, if you go to Montana and kick a sagebrush, a jackrabbit runs out one side and 2 cowboy poets out the other. So it is connected with a lot of people, and not all of them are ranch people, obviously. What is it? I don't know. You can sure feel it when you're in one of these sessions and that audience hooks into what's going on there. There's been some absolute magic moments here, Delco, over the years. People never forget it, And like that Episcopal priest I was talking about. For some reason, what I was doing in that little poem just connected with him. And he comes back, I think, every year or so and brings people with him, and he always comes and finds me. And had me make him a copy of that poem. And there was nothing complicated about that poem, nothing extraordinary about the poem. It was a rhymed poem about somebody who always wanted to be a cowboy and never got a chance. And went all the way through from the time he was a little kid till they buried him. And there's quite a bit of that around. See, when you get my age, you can start writing confessional poems, because anybody who could be embarrassed by the poem is dead, gone. So you can get away with this at my age. And so I recently wrote a poem called First Love. Her name was Judy. Graceful, elegant, beautiful brown eyes, soft red hair. I was just 16, spindly and awkward. She was 10 years older. Tom, the boss, said, go into the woods with Judy. She will teach you things you need to know and won't hurt you. If you hurt her, I will hurt you. It was a magic summer. We spent day after day deep in the woods, skidding logs. I loved her, and I miss her. Judy was a great mule.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Vess Quinlan for taking the time to visit with me. I don't believe Vess has a website, but I highly recommend you track him down and attend one of his poetry performances if you ever get the chance. If you'd like to find out more about me and this show, you can visit andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.